there is a hypothesis and a fear that Black people will be left behind if they're not present for those water cooler conversations, if they're not engaging with their managers in the same way. And there's a notion that people do feel that white males will probably be more dominant in office than any other dimensions of identity. Welcome to Corporate for the Culture, where our mission is to dismantle the career system to provide the next generation of Black corporate leaders with tools and a community to build the career they deserve. Today, we're having a really important conversation about return to office in the hybrid model and this hesitation that Black professionals are feeling and triggering of anxiety to re-enter the workplace. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with two amazing individuals, Olivia, DeAndrea. As our guests know and our listeners know, we always like to start our episodes with dimensions of identity because Black professionals are not monolithic. So Olivia, will you be able to share with us your dimensions of identity?
Hi, my name is Olivia Hewitt. I'm a workforce consultant based in New York City. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. A lot of my kind of lens on the world is informed by growing up in an affluent white suburb in Atlanta, and also going to a predominantly white private school, 6th to 12th grade in Atlanta, and being one out of 7 Black students out of a class of 205 graduating high school. Those kind of themes stuck with me through college, and just thinking about the ideas of inclusion and what it looks and feels like to really feel included and accepted in spaces where I was always acutely aware of being the only one oftentimes. So that takes us to my full-time job now, which at the end of the day, I'd like to think that I help organizations think through how to create environments where people feel like they're included, like they belong, and help them create environments where they can attract and retain a more diverse workforce.
Thank you, Olivia. What about you, Dee?
Thanks, Gabrielle. So I'm so glad to be here. I'm DeAndrea Staes, and as you can see, I go by Dee. I am also a consultant in workforce transformation, primarily focused on organizational change management. But a little bit about my background is I actually come from a lower middle class family, and was lucky enough to be able to go to a private school for Catholic private school for elementary and middle school. And these were both predominantly Black communities. And this was really all that I knew. And then in high school, I went to a charter public school. So still mostly a melting pot of cultures, which was amazing. And then I think my transition to college was to Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, where I studied economics, and really being around, my own culture for many, many years is what I knew. And I think the transition that I really experienced first was, I was exposed to corporate America early on. I worked for a tech company, and that was by way of a relationship. I met someone through a family member, and I worked there for roughly 5 years. And then shortly after leaving there, I went to business school and got my MBA from the University of Texas at Austin. And that's when, for the first time in the classroom, I experienced being the one. So it was 6 in my class total, so 2% of the population. And really in that moment, beyond all the things I had done in my life to contribute to the Black community, I'd done tons of community service. This was when I looked at it from a different lens and thinking about how can I really support my white peers, my non-Black peers, and understanding how to be successful leaders, especially when you have, a variety of cultures in the business world. So I think one of my greatest accomplishments, I think, in that time was creating and co-founding the Diversity and Inclusion Conference, which was really that first step in being able to do that. And I think I've taken that, started with the company I'm with now, to really be able to lean into that and continue to help support our leaders and think through ways for them to be strong allies and supportive, and really that the journey of their Black staff and in being successful in the firm. So yeah, it's a little bit about me.
Yeah, well, I just want to thank both of you for the work that you do, because bringing consciousness to these white leaders is really instrumental. And it's even part of this broader conversation that we're going to have today. Companies are now issuing policies for return to office or hybrid. There's a lot of different terminologies that are out there. And what's surfacing is, at least amongst my friends, I started having conversations around like the angst and the fear of what it would feel like to go back in the office, for a multitude of different ways in which we'll talk about. And a recent Fast Company article noted this vast difference between Black and white professionals. Out of this survey, only 3% of Black professionals wanted to return to the office. Just 3%, right? And that alone was part of this kind of shared reality that a lot of Black professionals have, and the lack of trust that we have for the system that is corporate America. And another study even said that, and I know it's not necessarily shocking to our listeners or our guests here today, but only 53% of Black workers said that they were treated fairly at work, and 54% of Black workers claimed a sense of belonging at work. So when you hear that, Olivia and Dee, what is your reaction to that?
I don't think it's not surprising by any means. I think for a variety of reasons, I think those stats are what they are. I think people feel a level of protection in their own homes and behind their computer screen, rightfully so, because they can turn their camera off when they're feeling like this conversation, it feels like it's excluding me, or it's not. Especially given all the things that we've been dealing around race relations within the last year that have come to surface and light, those conversations that they may not have to encounter in the break room in passing. We have the ability to kind of self-select where we need to be and why, when and where and why in this virtual environment. So that's not surprising. And then the second piece being flexibility that you have working remotely, that primarily, I wouldn't say not all, I think many people have benefited from remote working and the flexibility, but lots of marginalized groups have. So not surprising at all. And just a couple of the reasons that come to mind.
Yeah, I would agree in many ways. I think one of my reactions was it's a little bit disheartening, again, not surprising, but disheartening to think that almost half of a population of people don't feel supported at work, and just a small percentage are even interested in returning to work. And I think part of that, from what I've experienced or what I've heard or seen, is there's also that flavor of the pandemic that's really just steer people away from that desire to return to work, because one, it's plagued our community. That's an obvious thing, but also just how people are having to return to work. I think, Olivia, you called out something very interesting, having to address those race relations conversations that are just tend to be a drain for people. It's you don't have to do it if you're not face to face with people. So being able to kind of like disconnect after we already spend so much time in the day on calls, having some of these conversations, I think being able to disconnect is what people really want to be able to do, rather than being in the office all the time to have those kinds of conversations, which are just tough to have in general, but certainly disheartening to know that such a small percentage of people feel they're supported in, experiencing that myself. I get it, but it's, think a lot about how can we to make a shift so that people are not that level of like lack of support. But then again, always not surprised by this. So very interesting stats.
Yeah, I think you both bring up multiple good points. The number to me is shocking. And I remember reading an article, posted my thoughts via LinkedIn, because everyone is positioning. It's funny how people, you have to really do your research, because people will position things to be in their favor, right? So it's like, oh, the flexibility of a hybrid model and the virtual options to like disconnect make Black professionals thrive. But D, it's also to your point, like it's no, this is actually a problem, right? This is a problem that majority of your Black professionals are saying, I don't want to go back into the office because unlike in the past, race and politics is now a conversation that we have in our teams and in our work environment, right? That's something that we never had to deal with before. And there's fatigue because we don't know. We know that Black professionals were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, but we don't know every single person's trauma. And so when you re-enter and you start probing and asking questions, it's really about the Black preservation of our mental health when we have to come in and engage in a new way. And a lot of companies, because of the level of uncertainty, are just not ready for that.
Yeah, I think this past year has made us acutely aware of those conversations, but there's also the element of being Black in an office. You feel like you have to be a certain way or be on. So there's a level of authenticity that I think you're able to hold at home versus in the office. This doesn't apply to everyone, but there is always this, this, I guess, age-old quote corporate tale that many Black professionals, many marginalized groups don't feel like going to a happy hour with your team is an extra effort. It's an extra layer that they have to continue wearing until they get home. Now this extra layer they don't have to wear. So, and going back to the office is basically asking somebody to put it back on, which is effort. So I think it's this last year and the conversations that that could be traumatic in bringing up, but also just this consistent feeling of the belonging stat. Like, if I don't feel like I belong, so I have to put on an extra front when I walk through my office door.
I think this has come up quite a bit about bringing your authentic selves to work, or being able to bring your authentic selves to work. And I think right pre-pandemic, all the trauma that the Black community went through with the murder of George Floyd was when I think there were so many conversations happening in the workplace about, well, do you not, how do you feel? That was the constant question. How do you feel? Do you not feel like you can be your authentic self at work? And that's like a catch-22. It's like, how do I answer that question? Do I say, no, I can't be my authentic self at work? Or how do I describe what that means? And I think that a part of that is, trying to let those outside of our community into our world to be able to lean into being our authentic selves, which we just historically, Black people have been taught, show up one way at work, do your job and do it well. And that's it. There's no, I have things going on at home. I have things that are challenging me. You just put that to the side and you show up. And I think this period of time has really not allowed us to do that, because we are living in the things that we are experiencing at home. And I think really that level of inclusion is really something that I think Black people are trying to figure out. How do we bring this, how can we bring ourselves into the workforce authentically, still make sure we're feeling included without being offensive. So I think there's so many layers to this, and it's just one of those really challenging, I call it a conundrum, because it's just it's very challenging to figure out how do you address that. And really, I think part of it is figuring out how we support leaders in allowing people to be their authentic selves, while also them being inclusive and really being able to acknowledge their biases, because we're experiencing so much of that, or we have in the past. So it's really bringing that to the forefront to kind of figure out how can we lean in to really help support our community and mitigating some of their biases. But I think it's just a very interesting space.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, the showing up authentically as yourself requires the readiness of the people around you. Like you said, making sure those leaders, those people managers, those team members can hear you in a way where they know how to address it and they know how to show up. And that's what we're trying to teach people how to do. But I mean, that's why we have these particular conversations on this podcast, because the reality is it's going to take a long time for corporate culture to change. And so how do we as Black professionals stay as true to ourselves as we want to be in the office place? And what are those key considerations that we need to take into account? Because the reality is the reality, right? It's the readiness, awareness, and commitment, as much as we would like to say is truly out there. You know, we've seen all of these broken promises from when George Floyd was murdered to what has actually been put into motion today. But I want to lead back to where we were. We did a pulse survey on Fishbowl, and hopefully you both are familiar with Fishbowl, where we asked Black professionals how they were feeling. So I heard how the two of you were feeling, and thought I would share this as well. But one person says, I won't be able to turn my camera off in person when I want to react without repercussions. So Olivia, it's kind of what you were saying. Another person said, I'm not looking forward to answering 20 questions about my ethnic lunch, which I thought was pretty funny. And then this one is my favorite. I'm going to lose my mind if I have to deal with Karens face to face again. So I mean, it's true, right? The microaggressions are real. The conversations that we don't want to have are real. And it's a interesting period to say, okay, what are the trade-offs if I don't engage in a certain way? And how do I protect my psychological safety and all of that in my mindset in general? But if they could take away that humor and take a step forward and say, okay, now let's talk about the return to office for our listeners who are at some capacity going to return, if it's 1-2 times a week or a month. There are a couple of things that have been coming up that this conversation, what we want to do is bring to your consciousness. And we want to bring this to your consciousness because a lot of people may have opted into a return to office setting, but are not really thinking about what does that actually mean? How do I stay engaged so that I'm not left behind? And so there are elements. One that I talked to the ladies about before is this new bias called proximity bias. And this is a subconscious belief that people will produce better work if they are physically present in the office. Another terminology that has been arised that's similar is something called present privilege. So that's also the notion that those who are present in the office will have more promotions, opportunities, etc. So there is a hypothesis and a fear that Black people will be left behind if they're not present for those water cooler conversations, if they're not engaging with their managers in the same way. And there's a notion that people do feel that white males will probably be more dominant in office than any other dimensions of identity. Between the two of you, what do you believe Black professionals should be mindful of if they opt into the virtual option so that they are not left behind?
So I think, and people scoff at this, but I think it's worked rather well, I think for myself and others during this pandemic year plus, is making sure that if you're going to stay virtual, schedule regular touch points with the people that you know that are advocates of yours, mentors, and ultimately have influence over your career and providing those development opportunities for you. Whether it's just catch-ups, real pointed conversations that you need to have, I think those are rather effective, and making sure that you are top of mind for that person, whether that's through a calendar invite or a check-in email, I think can work rather well. And if you were going in, I think it's just being intentional about the days that you do decide to go in. Those are on the employee, kind of what the two that I just described. I think the other part of it, though, is organizations do need to step it up in terms of trying to create communities that people feel like, okay, like I'm comfortable going into the office. It's not throwing money at an employee resource group. It's actually thinking intentionally about what's the programming that might incentivize an employee to actually come in and feel like they belong there. And also enabling virtual infrastructure that people feel like they are actually getting work done and doing it a meaningful way in a virtual environment.
And do you mind just explaining a little bit more around what does it look like to be intentional the days that you go in the office?
Yeah. So, for instance, now I try and coordinate with the main director of my project the days that we go in together, because the purpose of being like, it's nice to see somebody in person, just for me personally, but also we're to collaborate and think through problems together. And that's the point I made earlier about being top of mind for that person. Yes, it can be through an email or through a virtual chat, but that going into the office that day with your director, whomever, is that plug for you to stay top of mind. But it also doesn't necessarily have to be just a leader. It could be a group of colleagues that you go in all together one day just to have people around while you work. So yeah, I think planning a week or so ahead is worth it. So.
Yeah, I think those are great suggestions. Dee, what about you?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that I kind of jotted down, and thinking through that, a couple other things that I think might be really interesting, and I think it's could be valuable in how you also create that connection with your leaders and your teams. It might sound counterproductive, but it's really valuable. Establish boundaries. So I think one of the most valuable things over the last year certainly is creating protected time for yourself, because one, I think it's supporting or protecting your mental health, but also it's a signal to your leadership that, you know, we're human. They are also human. And that, I think being able to kind of set those boundaries to say, these are working hours that work for me. You know, I want to understand what works for you. You're creating that sense of connectivity with your leaders. And I think the other piece to that is being vulnerable, which I think if I can say for myself and probably many others in our community, that is the last thing we think about when coming into the workplace. So I think being able to be vulnerable enough to kind of talk about those things that are, you know, important to you really takes down the wall, and it adds that layer of connectedness that I think is critical in a virtual environment. So really being able to create those blocks of time and clear expectations, I think is really, really helpful. And I think one other thing that Olivia called out that I wanted to lean in a little bit more on is like, what does that meeting or that community feel like, that sense of community feel like? And I think if leaders can really focus on how do you create a hybrid meeting experience. So people that may not be in the room, if you are a leader and you're not in the room with your team, how are you creating a space where everyone feels like they can contribute or they can be involved or they know what's going on? Is it, hey, we're all going to be in a room together, those that are sitting in a space together, and we're going to just leave our phones on, or we're going to open up a chat session, and then that's kind of like open office hour. So it's really, that's where we brainstorm together. That's an option. But also as a team member, I think being able to kind of express what those options that you might think will be valuable through your team, speaking up and expressing those as well. Because I think some leaders are still figuring it all out too. Like they have no clue the best way to live or lead in a hybrid environment. And I think we, as those who are experiencing it, have to lean in and provide options or suggestions. And I think that is just another way to create this sense of connectivity. So I think that's so critical, is being able to speak up and express what you need to feel connected, and having really, really healthy conversations with your managers, your leaders, and if you're a leader, your teammates or your team members.
Yeah, there's a couple more that come to mind. I think these are all great suggestions. You know, Dee, one thing that I think is important to your point is the fact that we're all going through this change together. There is a need to communicate more and have more transparency. So some of the articles that I was reading, and one element that I really enjoyed is if you are in a moment of discomfort, you're probably not alone. Usually multiple people have a similar feeling. I know that I used to get this when I used to watch the VMAs and be on Twitter and realize everyone's kind of thinking the same thing that I am, right? Like really not that special, right, at the end of the day. But it's this notion of like seeking out those who share in your experience, and they don't have to be the same race, ethnicity, gender, etc., but they share in that experience and need for change, and come as a collective group to your leaders to say, hey, this is impacting our ability to show up at work because of X, Y, and Z, right? I loved that tip. Another one that I thought was really interesting too, and this actually came from an episode we did around discrimination in the workplace around keeping receipts. So you can't expect that everyone is in good intentions. So when decisions are made or things are communicated or things that you like or dislike, because it could be both, make sure you keep a record of that. So if a manager tells you something via the phone or via a virtual meeting, send an email back with exactly what the decision was made, right? And then one that I just thought of as well, too, is like, I think vulnerability has to come from both sides. It depends on who you are as a person. Because I work in D&I have now flexed my vulnerability muscle a lot over the year and a half. But I know that based on different voices that we've heard, like not everyone wants to be vulnerable. Not everyone wants to do anything else besides show up, do their job, and then go home, right? Not everyone wants to steward the change, and that's okay. When I think about boundaries and expectations, just make sure that you stay true to your values, and that at the end of the day, you can live with those trade-offs and make sure that you measure those trade-offs. And also tell your managers to be as vulnerable or as transparent. So those are a couple that came to my mind, but a lot of great tips that were shared here.
I would add one too, Gabrielle. I think in like key considerations, one other thing that I've seen works really well are establishing guiding principles. So on the front end, really, how are we, what are our intentions in this meeting? How are we trying to move forward? I think setting guiding principles sets a standard that everyone is, working towards the same goal. So I think that was one other thing that came to mind. But I think I do want to call out the vulnerability thing, because I think for me, not working in the D&I space, this was new for me. And when I say new, like maybe 5-6 months new, I just thought that was unreasonable to be vulnerable at work. And I think one thing, just as a clarifying point, it's find your level of comfortability when it comes to being vulnerable. It's not spill everything. It's just what's enough that you're opening something to yourself that is in alignment with your morals and your standards, but also really gives you that opportunity to kind of connect more with people. So just wanted to share that it's new for me, and I know it's new for many. So
probably should have asked this earlier, because Olivia, it sounds like you're going in office. Dee, are you going back or moving with the tide?
I'm a little bit moving with the tide, I think. We'll see. Half of me wants to go in the office. Been getting all kinds of invitations for being in the office and connectivity, and already I'm like, oh, it's overwhelming. But just trying to find ways to virtually connect with people if there are those kinds of events until I feel 100% comfortable. But I think, by the new year, I think I'll be ready.
I was very much ready to go back. I need, personally, the balance of seeing other people aside from my sister, love her, but like, it's a lot working in the same place every day. By like March, April, I was like, this feels like Groundhog Day every single day. And I like the variety was what I missed. So happy to have the balance currently.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I'm not sure how I feel. I'm at a place where I didn't opt into all virtual. And because I personally, transparently thought that was career suicide, because as consultants, we navigate and move with our clients. And so just because our firm is having this great initiative and has weighed the pros and cons, it doesn't mean that our clients have done the same. And so at the end of the day, when you're a revenue driven company, like you gotta be open to different types of opportunities. So that was the reason why I was like, I just don't feel personally comfortable with the virtual option, though I know some friends who have taken virtual, which is great, so they could be there for their families, and everyone's at different career stages. But the return to office, it's like, for me personally, I probably won't know. I've been so distant from it that I don't know until I'm there. But there's nothing gravitating me to return to the office because none of my team is in this area. So it's like, why would I go into the office? I just don't understand. Um, but it is interesting to hear other people's excitements, thoughts, and then me, I'm completely neutral. So it's an interesting one. But I
We'll
mean,
see.
yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, everyone just needs to take care of themselves and weigh their own decisions. I know some people are feeling a lot of weight from their clients to return to the office as well, and they're not ready. So that's also like not a good place to be in. So thinking about everyone as they're navigating this uncertainty. So this has been an amazing conversation. And I appreciate both of you so much. In terms of just wrapping up, if there's anything else, I know we did a lot of tips, things to be conscious about, but again, it doesn't have to necessarily be about hybrid workplace, but our audience are mid-level Black professionals. So if you have any sentiments or words of wisdom or anything that you want to share with our audience.
I think I have one thing that comes to mind, and I think it's both relevant to the hybrid situation and then beyond that. I think now more than ever, at least this is something that I've learned, is understanding the value of building relationships and authentic relationships, like really leaning into those genuine opportunities to connect with your peers, your leaders. I think that will really help no matter how you transition from a hybrid perspective. But I think from a career, like growing your career, I think it's a lost art to connect with people. And I think this is the perfect time while we're living in a virtual world to just find those with shared experiences even. I think, Gabrielle, you mentioned that. Think about people who have shared experiences and those who maybe want to learn more about you, and just start to create those relationships that I think will, in the long term, really be valuable as you navigate in whatever direction that is. So.
I think one thing, connecting back to just bringing a level of vulnerability and transparency to the workplace, whether that's setting boundaries and the things that you need. I think that's important in navigating this hybrid world, but also important skill to build as just a leader. So you set an example for just teams in general and other newer Black professionals coming into the workplace, because I know certainly if I didn't have those people setting boundaries and being transparent to me that they had to go be off at 5 to pick up their kid, or they needed to go to work at class to clear their head, I certainly would be doing it now. So just food for thought.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, we absorb the culture that our leaders set. So thank you again, both, for having this conversation, this roundtable conversation on hybrid workplace return to office.